You know, we've heard the word unhinged a lot this weekend, probably more than any weekend ever, but I just want you to imagine. Let me set the scene, okay? You're finishing your Easter brunch, cleaning up, the kids are running out to the yard to find jelly beans, and suddenly your 79-year-old grandpa stands up and he yells, "Open the straight, you crazy bastards!"
Most people who watched that night thought the transcript was the story. Nobody caught what the transcript was hiding until Kimmel read the last 3 lines aloud. The folder was already open on the desk. Kimmel's finger was moving down the page at the deliberate pace of someone who has read the document many times and is now, for the first time, reading it for an audience. Trump's right hand had stopped moving. His jaw was set in the specific way jaws set when the muscles are being consciously directed not to move. The audience in Studio H was not making a sound, not a shuffle, not a cough, just the absolute collective stillness of people who have understood that something is being taken away from someone in real time, and that the someone is the man sitting 3 feet from the desk. But to understand how they got here, to understand what the folder contained and why the silence in that room had a different quality than any silence that studio had held in 11 years of broadcasts, you have to go back to the moment the night began. The pre-show atmosphere inside the El Capitan production facility had the texture of a held breath. The studio lighting crew had been asked to push the fill lights half a stop warmer than the standard configuration. A small adjustment, barely visible on camera, but perceptible in the room as a quality of enclosure, of intimacy, as if the space itself had been asked to pay closer attention. The lead audio engineer later said he ran a second-level check at 7:14 for no reason he could technically justify, only that the room felt like it was waiting for something that would require perfect clarity. Jimmy Kimmel was seated before the audience filed in. He had a single folder on the desk, closed. He had a glass of water. He had his hands resting flat on the surface and his eyes on the side door, and the stillness in his body was the stillness of someone who has already completed every version of this conversation in his own mind and has arrived at the only one worth having. Trump entered from the East Corridor rather than the standard green room passage, a deviation from the production schedule that the floor director absorbed without comment and would mention in detail to 3 separate journalists over the following 48 hours. The walk was the walk of a man whose relationship with a room begins before he enters it. Slow, deliberate, each footfall placed with the certainty of someone who expects the floor to accept his weight as tribute. He stopped before the chair and did something that the front rows of the audience would describe differently from the back rows. To the front, it looked like adjusting. His hands went to his jacket, his tie, a small sequence of calibrations before sitting. To the back, it read as something else, as a pause that announced itself, a moment of display before the claim. He spread into the chair the way water spreads into a low place, filling it without effort, without decision, simply because that is what it does. His eyes moved to Kimmel and stayed there, flat, certain, measuring the distance between where he was and where he intended to be by the end of the hour. When he spoke his first words, they arrived in the register of a man who has decided to be generous. "You know, I've always respected people who know their limitations," he said, directing the observation at Kimmel with the warmth of a man handing someone a smaller trophy. "It takes a certain intelligence to recognize you're not in the first tier." The studio audience produced a sound that was not laughter and not its opposite. What followed occupied the next 8 minutes and would later be described by the show's supervising producer as the quietest storm she had ever watched build from inside a building. Trump moved through his attack categories with the fluency of someone delivering a practiced position. He told Kimmel his ratings were a rounding error on the network's annual report. He said that the entire landscape of late-night television had been kept alive by the content that Trump's existence generated, and that without that content, the studios would go dark within a quarter. He made it personal next. Not cruel, which would have required effort, but dismissive, which required none. An aging comedian, he said, chasing the relevance that had belonged to a different version of himself in a different decade. He built to the power claim with the ease of a man who has made this particular argument so many times that it no longer requires construction, only delivery. He ran rooms. He ran outcomes. The buildings that housed networks and studios, and the advertising ecosystems that sustained them all, existed within an architecture of influence that he had spent 40 years building, and that Kimmel sat inside without acknowledgement or gratitude. He finished with the dismissal, conversational, the most dangerous register. "At the end of the day," he said, "the room comes to me. It always has." A young woman in the second row looked at the person beside her. The look lasted 1 second and carried everything that the room could not say out loud. Kimmel had not moved. His hands had not moved. His expression had not changed. He had allowed every word to arrive, to occupy the space it claimed, and to stay there, and the staying was the problem, because silence does not dilute noise in a room like that. It concentrates it. The longer Trump's words sat without a response, the more the words had to account for themselves. And they were discovering, in the accounting, that they came up short. You could feel the moment shift before you could name it. It was in the way Kimmel's head tilted. Very slightly, less than a degree, the adjustment of someone who has finished listening and is about to begin. He reached for the folder with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment, and is in no danger of rushing it now. His voice, when he spoke, was lower than it had been during the opening. Not louder, quieter, precisely, deliberately quieter. You walked in talking about winners, he said. But the first thing you did was try to shut down a question. That's not strength, that's damage control. He let it sit for one full breath. Then he opened the folder. The first item was a video clip, and the screen behind them changed before he had finished describing it. Trump, 12 years prior, at a nationally broadcast interview making a specific claim about his academic record at the Wharton School of Finance. Not a general claim, a specific one. Percentile rankings, departmental distinctions, the word exceptional used in a context that implied official documentation. The host of that interview, visible in the clip, had accepted the claim without challenge. The clip ran for 41 seconds. Kimmel let it run to its end. Then he asked a question in the tone of someone asking about weather. When you say your professors called you the smartest student they'd ever seen, were you quoting a document or a feeling? Trump's jaw shifted. His left hand came off the armrest and went flat on his thigh. He said the media always did this, took statements out of context, compressed years of documented achievement into a clip designed to mislead. Kimmel looked at him steadily. The clip is unedited, he said. We have the timestamp certification. A man in the fifth row put his elbow on his knee and his chin in his hand and stared at the desk. Then Kimmel reached under the surface. The folder he lifted was different from the one already open, thicker, with a tab visible along the side edge. A color-coded marker that the front rows could see was not decorative. He placed it on the desk without opening it immediately. He described the first document before revealing it. Official institutional correspondence. Bearing the registrar's letterhead of the Wharton School, a response to a records inquiry, he opened to the first tabbed section and turned it to face the camera. The document was not what Trump had described. It was not consistent with the claim of departmental distinction. It was a standard academic record, unremarkable in the specific ways that records are unremarkable when the remarkable version has been constructed afterward, in public, across 4 decades of repetition, until the construction and the record became impossible to distinguish without the paperwork in the room. Trump's hand moved toward the folder, not fast. A reach, the motion of someone who does not intend to grab, but to access. Kimmel placed his palm flat on the cover without looking up from the page he was reading. "We'll get there," he said. The camera caught the retraction of Trump's wrist, and the catching was the story. A door near the side curtain opened. The screen had already changed to display a timeline. Dates in clean white type, white on dark, each point connected to the next by a horizontal line that moved left to right across the screen, with the patience of a document that has been waiting a long time to be read in public. The timeline mapped the public claims against the institutional record. The first public claim, 1987. The first documentary request filed by a journalist seeking the underlying academic record, 2011. The result of that request, denied, citing privacy protocols. The second request, 2015. Result, denied. The third request, filed under a different legal framework, following a change in applicable statute, granted, conditionally, with redactions, in 2024. The redacted version. And beside it, on the right half of the screen, the unredacted version, obtained through a separate channel, bearing a verification stamp from the institution's own records office. The geometry of those two documents, the shape of what one contained that the other did not, the precise contour of the information that had been removed in one and preserved in the other, was not subtle. Trump talked over the timeline. His voice filled the space between the dates. Kimmel slowed down. Each word he spoke arrived with more room around it than the last. "The geometry doesn't lie," he said, not looking up from the page, "even when every person in the room does." Nobody moved for a moment that the audience would later describe as feeling much longer than it was. The audio file played next, a backstage recording, not studio feed, not broadcast quality, but the specific grain of a device left running in a private setting, the audio certification from an independent forensic firm visible on the monitor as it played. Trump's voice, unguarded, speaking to someone off camera in a tone that assumed no audience. The content was 3 sentences. In the first, he referenced the academic claims as strategic. In the second, he used the phrase, "nobody actually checks." In the third, he laughed. The laugh was the worst part. Not cruel, not calculating, just easy, casual. The laugh of a man in a room where he believes the story belongs entirely to him. Kimmel let the recording run to its end. Trump said it was fabricated, manufactured by the same media apparatus that had been targeting him for years. Kimmel reached for the certification report and held it up without speaking. The methodology was on page 1. The conclusion was on page 2. No evidence of editing, no evidence of construction. The voice on the recording was the voice of the man sitting across the desk. A woman near the back pressed her closed fist against her lips and kept it there. Then a voice came from the side of the stage. A man. 50s, former administrative coordinator in the Wharton School's registrar office, a position he had held for 9 years before a voluntary departure he described without elaboration as a decision made for personal reasons that had since become less personal and more necessary. He spoke quietly. His testimony was procedural, what he had been asked to do, specifically on what dates and on whose instruction. He described receiving a request, not from the institution but through an intermediary, to flag certain records for restricted access status. He described flagging them. He described later the connection between those flags and the subsequent denials of journalistic records inquiries. His voice did not shake. His hands were in his lap, and they were still. He said he had arrived at the studio 3 hours early and sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away and ordered the same thing twice without drinking either one. He said it because the interviewer had asked how he felt, and he had decided that honesty at this point cost less than it used to. Trump called him bitter, compromised, a minor functionary with a grudge dressed up as a conscience. The man absorbed the description. When he spoke again, it was at the pace of someone who no longer has a reason to hurry. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid," he said, "but I was more afraid of what it meant if I never spoke." The second witness was younger, a woman who had worked as a research assistant to a communications consultant retained by Trump's organization during the years the academic narrative was being consolidated for public use. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement. She said so, clearly, and then she continued speaking, her voice held before the first sentence. A visible pause, the throat working, the jaw settling, the hands in her lap gripping each other until the knuckles reached a color that is not quite white, but close enough that the front row could see it. She named dates. She named the specific narrative elements she had been asked to research, source, and in 2 cases, fabricate supporting context for. She described the internal language used for this process. Not fraud, not falsification, but elevation. The word had been used without irony, she said, and that had been the thing that had stayed with her. When Trump leaned forward and said, "You are betraying people who trusted you," her eyes moved to him and held there with a stillness that was not blank. It was full. "Fear doesn't age well," she said. "It turns into something heavier, and I'm done carrying it." The audience did not erupt. The audience did not cheer. One person, a man in the left section, second row from the back, brought his hands together once, slowly, then again. The sound was deliberate, the way the sound of 2 hands meeting is deliberate when it is not performance, but recognition. A second person joined from across the room, then a third, then a row, then the whole studio, in that particular wave that does not crest and crash but rises steadily, a tide coming in rather than a wave breaking, hands coming together because the alternative, sitting still in the presence of what had just been said, was no longer possible. Trump was still in his chair when the clapping reached its height, and then he was not. His breathing had been audible for several minutes before the witnesses spoke. Not ragged, but present, the chest operating with a speed that his posture was working to conceal. His hands had migrated from the armrests to his thighs to a grip on the desk edge that turned the skin at his knuckles pale. His posture had compressed, not dramatically, not in the theatrical collapse of a man performing defeat, but in the slow, structural settlement of someone whose weight is no longer being held by the same internal architecture it was resting on when the evening began. His eyes had stopped settling. They moved through the room, to the witnesses, to the screen, to Kimmel, to the cameras, to the space behind the cameras where the dark of the studio began, and found nothing they could hold. His voice, when it came back, was in the accusation register. This was coordinated, planned, a hit operation using the apparatus of entertainment as a political weapon. It climbed into the procedural complaint. There were legal implications to what was being shown tonight, significant legal implications, and his attorneys were already aware. It arrived at the Bravado station and stayed there longer than the other stops, the voice insisting that he had been through impeachments, through indictments, through every institutional assault the opposition had ever managed to assemble. He was still here. He was always still here. The screen changed for the last time. 2 columns. Left, domestic institutional records, the Wharton records, the communications consultant's internal files, the registry flags, all dated, all sourced. Right, a separate set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of an international academic credentialing service operating under a private equity structure in a jurisdiction with strong privacy protections. Documents that bore a name that was not Trump's name, but matched it in every structural way that a name constructed for use in private correspondence matches the name constructed for use in public life. Kimmel did not rush the moment. He looked at the screen. He looked at Trump. He said, "We've been looking at the claims. We've been looking at the record. And then we looked at the geometry of the distance between them." He paused. "The geometry of that distance has a shape," he said, "and the shape has a name." He waited one full breath. "Your move!" Trump's mouth opened. The room held itself absolutely still. The kind of stillness where the sound system becomes audible, where you can hear the faint ambient hiss of equipment doing its job. The floor director near the back of the set had his headset pulled half off, suspended there, neither on nor off, as if completing the motion had become irrelevant. A camera operator held her lens on the empty expression on Trump's face for 27 seconds after he stood and moved toward the corridor. She could not look away. He moved the way a man moves through a building he is leaving because he has run out of reasons to stay. Within 11 minutes, the first clip was live. Within 30, the broadcast had been cut into 16 independent segments circulating at different velocities across different platforms. A major network broke into its programming to display both documents side by side without commentary. The domestic record and the international record, the claimed geometry and the documented geometry, letting the alignment carry its own weight without an anchor explaining it. Trump's counterstatements began arriving shortly after midnight. The first was measured. The second was longer and angrier. The third deployed capital letters with the desperation of someone who has discovered that volume in text works differently than volume in a room. Each statement was screenshot and placed beside the specific clip it was denying. On the left, Kimmel, still, composed, reading. On the right, the escalating text. The comparison did not need framing. Forums began cross-referencing the credentialing service's registration history, the private equity structure, the years of operation, the other names in its client registry that had since entered public life under different identities. The promised legal action was not filed. The official counter-documentation did not arrive. Months later, people were still watching the clip of the camera operator holding her lens on the empty chair, asking what she had seen in those 27 seconds that she could not bring herself to stop recording. Truth doesn't announce itself. It waits for someone to read it out loud. If this changed how you see power, hit subscribe. If it didn't, watch it again. The details you missed the first time are the ones that matter most. Notifications on. Next one drops soon.